It's a presidential tweet that may ultimately amount to a smoking gun in the investigation into whether Donald Trump Jr. conspired with the Russians to impact the 2016 election, and whether the president's aides obstructed justice when they lied about the Trump Tower meeting being about adoption. With the presidential interview with special counsel Robert Mueller still up in the air, President Trump is doing his best to answer as many of Robert Mueller's questions on Twitter as possible, tweeting this weekend a confirmation that his son did indeed meet with Russians to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. The president writing, quote, "This was a meeting to get information on an opponent, totally legal and done all the time in politics, and it went nowhere. I did not know about it." The New York Times fact checks that for us, writing, "It is illegal for a campaign to accept help from a foreign individual or government. The president and his son have maintained that the campaign did not ultimately receive any damaging materials about Mrs. Clinton as a result of the meeting. But some legal experts contend that by simply sitting for the meeting, Donald Trump Jr. broke the law. Aside from being illegal, the president is also wrong about such meetings being done all the time in politics. They are not. But his tweet signals growing panic from the president himself. And there may very well be ample cause for his concern. A source close to the Trump legal effort tells me today that the president's conduct since the Trump Tower meeting, his efforts to cover up the real purpose of the meeting, and conversations he has had with White House aides about it point to an increasing likelihood that the president could be vulnerable to charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. It also brings back into focus the ongoing legal jeopardy facing all of the individuals who have testified to Robert Mueller about the crafting of the original false statement and any conversations they may have had with the president about their testimony. With all this in mind, we wondered, what did Hope Hicks and the president talk about on the plane this weekend? Joining us to discuss that and all the day's developments, some of our favorite friends and reporters, MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi, a former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for the Washington Post, and here at the table, Anita Kumar, White House correspondent for McClatchy, and MSNBC and NBC News national affairs analyst John Heilemann. Thank you very much for anchoring this show Thursday and Friday.
It was my pleasure. You know, you have the best audience in the business, right?
They are the best, and they love you. I love the love.
Great audience, great guests, and great staff. The staff on this show, so top-notch.
And I loved all the love for you. I'm going to start, though, with you, Frank Figliuzzi. This source close to the Trump legal team and still in contact with members of it, past and current, telling me that the president's conduct and the fact that he's thrusting this Trump Tower meeting, the lies told about it, the actual genesis of it back into the spotlight suggests that he may have some increasing awareness, either conscious or subconscious, of his own legal jeopardy.
Yeah, something's particularly got under his skin over the last few days, Nicole. And while we'd be engaging in conjecture, I think it's more than just media coverage of this. I think there's something else going on here. He may sense or even have information that perhaps Don Jr. is criminally exposed and looking at a target letter or some form of grand jury proceeding. It may be that he's heard something about Cohen and the veracity of Cohen's assertion about the Trump Tower meeting, and that the president knew about it. Something directly has him spooked. But it's caused him to make a tactical error, which is to come out and essentially throw his son and his son-in-law under the bus and say, yes, they were there to get dirt on Hillary Clinton.
Okay, and joining Jared and his son under the bus was Jay Sekulow, one of his last remaining TV lawyers, other than Rudy Giuliani, who may just have the TV part of that job. Let's look at his statements now, rendered as someone who's been on both sides of the question about what the president knew about the Trump Tower meeting.
So when you look at a meeting, George, that took place in a year before or not 2 years ago, the question is, what law, statute, or rule or regulation has been violated? And nobody's pointed to one.
Well, they actually pointed to several, including conspiracy to defraud the United States. That would be one of the possible charges, aiding and abetting conspiracy.
You buy that that's a serious risk for Donald Trump Jr. and perhaps Jared? Frank?
Yeah, if you're talking to me, let me tell you something. If Jay Sekulow is pretending that he doesn't know the federal election campaign laws, then Trump has more of a problem than we realize. Of course, it's against the law, and of course, there's a conspiracy aspect to it, even though it didn't happen. So when we have a communication from Don Jr. saying, "I love it," in response to there's dirt on Hillary, and he shows up for the meeting, there's a legal problem to that. Sekulow is is just in another planet at this point.
Let me ask you about someone else who may wish she's on another planet. The theory was posited to me that Hope Hicks, between the time that she was known to have gone before Mueller's investigators and the time that she ultimately left the White House, may have had a few challenges in the workplace. One, she may have been queried by the president about what she said to Robert Mueller's investigators. Two, she may have been confronted either by Mueller's investigators or back-channel conversations that her lawyer had with other lawyers, that her accounts weren't necessarily in line with those given by other people. I think there were 6 people, Hope Hicks, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, Don McGahn, and Josh Rafael, and I think James Berman, who was a deputy in the counsel's office, who were added to Bob Mueller's list of people he wanted to interview sometime around that period after the statement was crafted aboard Air Force One. Do you think there's any scenario where Hope Hicks has now offered to cooperate or offer something up to Bob Mueller if she did in fact give some sort of different account, or if she did have to call and say that the president had asked her about her testimony?
The way this usually works, Nicole, is that such a person, a witness, is called in and saying and given a shot. Look, you've given us information that's inconsistent with what others are telling us. There's a veracity problem here, and you're actually facing a violation of USC Section 1001, lying to a federal agent. We're going to give you one shot to correct that and cooperate. And she either has or she hasn't. I got to tell you, the mysterious appearance over the weekend on Air Force One is a head scratcher to me, and I hope that no one is attempting to tamper with this witness, because that is a serious federal violation. And
Aaron Blake, we know from reporting in the New York Times that the president is being, and I believe your colleagues have run this down as well, the president is being investigated under a beefed up witness tampering law put in effect after Enron, and there are some of the Enron prosecutors and investigators who are also part of Bob Mueller's team. I mean, this is a real raw nerve for the president, a real area of exposure.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that we've gotten a whiff of this kind of thing potentially going on, or at least face questions about it potentially going on. There were a couple instances back when he was in the White House in which he talked to Reince Priebus and Don McGahn that there was potentially running into some foul territory here. There are real questions about whether the president, just by his public comments, I would add, is really able to separate what he's able to say and do as the subject of an investigation and what he's actually supposed to do. And so the idea that he wouldn't be doing this necessarily behind closed doors is, I think, a little bit difficult for some people to swallow. Now, whether any of that rises to the level of illegality is another question entirely, but certainly he's shown that he's not terribly careful about these, at least by outward appearances.
And you write today that here's the thing. This is a tweet about how, this is about the president's tweet yesterday morning. This is a tweet about how the Trump Tower meeting was totally fine, nothing illegal to see here. If you've got no real concern about legal exposure from the meeting, why distance yourself from it? Has anyone offered you any plausible explanations to your very astute point there?
Yeah, I think everybody's focusing on the admission that this was in fact about opposition research. What about the fact that in the space of one tweet, we have the president both arguing that this is totally much ado about nothing, not illegal at all. Oh, and by the way, I wasn't involved in it at all, just in case there was something going on here. There's no reason to separate yourself from something like this if there was nothing wrong about it. And so the fact that he slipped that in at the end of a tweet about how there was really nothing wrong here, I think belies the actual feelings and what he's being told by his lawyers, which is that collusion is in fact a crime and that this is at least in a very much a legal gray area.
John, I've heard in the last couple of days that there was actually a debate at the time that I think the Times and the Post were calling about this meeting, and when that statement was crafted aboard Air Force One, there were people on the legal team and around it that argued for just going to Mueller and telling them the whole story. Those people lost. Yep. The lie was told that the meeting was about Russian adoptions. That was never the case. The president's now corrected the record. But if you look at Scooter Libby, if you look at people who have been, look at Bill Clinton. I mean, it is almost always obstruction of justice and perjury that trips people up in special counsel investigations.
And there's almost always, in all of the special counsels that I've covered, there's always a cadre within every administration who's making that argument for more disclosure. Rip the Band-Aid off. Let's get whatever the troubles are, get them out as fast as possible. It's going to be better for us in the long run, politically and legally. And almost always they lose because for a variety of reasons. We've heard a lot about this period. We've not heard everything that we're going to hear about that period to this point. But I think the president, it's an extraordinary thing, and I think it's just worth stepping back for a second and just acknowledging what just happened here. The president lies all the time. We know he lies all the time. The lies are unacceptable. 4,000, whatever he's told in 8 months, according to these counts. But this lie is a different order of lie, and for the president to go on in a kind of in some kind of a fit over the weekend and basically say, I just come straight out and say, you know what, the story I told you, I lied about this. And I'm worried about my son, and I'm either too dumb or actually don't care. But one way or the other, I am, as Frank said, he just threw his son under the bus. I mean, the admission of it is an admission of an incredible lie.
Because he can't be impeached, but his son can be charged.
That's correct, and the lie is a historic lie that he told. The admission is a potentially cataclysmic admission. For the whole, this element of the investigation, and particularly for his son, who his father has basically just went on Twitter and testified against.
Well, so Frank, can you unpack that for us? Because we stare at these trees. We stare at a tweet as though it's a tree, but the forest really is it started as a counterintelligence investigation by the FBI, part of the Bureau you're very, very familiar with. And we now have the president corroborating a fact about why his son went in and met with Russians. And I talked to someone who knew a little bit about this meeting and said that they always knew this was a meeting, and in attendance were Russians close to the Kremlin and with ties to Russian government officials. Is that potentially more evidence that the prosecutors could use, investigators could use against Don Jr.?
There's no question here, and what height of irony for a father's tweet to become Exhibit A in evidence against the son. I was joking over the weekend on the air that the folks at Twitter should essentially install a pop-up Miranda warning on the president's Twitter account. You know, just saying, hey, you have the right to remain silent. Please use your right to remain silent. But yes, indeed, we have potentially evidence in the form of a tweet. And ironically, if the president had come out previously and just said, look, we're new at this. We were voted in because we're from outside Washington. We didn't know what we were doing. Here's the story. The cover-up is always worse than the crime.
The stupidity defense, right. I mean, it can be deployed and it's plausible.
But it's too late. It's too late for that. The president's hubris, his inability to say, I screwed up, I got it wrong, is actually going to cause his downfall. And I think that's where we're headed today.
And the new questions about Hope Hicks, seeing her on the plane, renewed questions about that period of time from which we know she went in and testified to Robert Mueller, questions about whether her testimony was consistent with that of the other people. I think we can put their names up. Hope Hicks, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, Don McGahn, James Berman, and Josh Rafael were all, their names were all submitted to the White House in that period right after that statement was crafted aboard Air Force One that turned out to be a lie, and the president now agreeing that that statement was a lie. Are you hearing any reporting from your sources about either the role that Hope Hicks may have played in providing information about the conversations the president was prone to have with close aides about what the experience was like in the Mueller room?
I am hearing from some people that they have pushed back that they talked about it this weekend. No, that's not why she was there, but not that they're going to say that's the reason. You know, the list you have is interesting because most of those people don't work there anymore, right?
Right.
So one thing about President Trump is that you can leave, but you're still kind of in his orbit, right?
Right, it's a hotel call. You can check out, but you can never leave.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.